Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, whenever you are watching this. Welcome to this audio guide class about the presidency of George Washington. I am Mr. Swanson, Bacon County High School, Alma, Georgia. If you're watching this, you're most likely in my class, and I'm not in class today, but this audio guide is going to serve as our lecture for the day. You do have your work packet of notes. You got some articles to read and some fill in the blank notes to complete. But with me not being present, here's a little bit of a lecture for you. Or if you're just on the internet and you found this, well, come on in. I'll teach you a little bit about the presidency of George Washington. For my class, go ahead and in your work packet, find these fill in the blank notes. And also, if you have flipped through the work packet, at this point, you realize there's a couple of pages of reading really before this lesson. Hopefully, you've already done that, and if you haven't, there'll be time at the end of lesson for it. There's also this page, looks more open-ended notes, and you can see picture of George Washington and then a couple of categories about him. You might say, wait a second, isn't that a little redundant? Isn't that something I've already written down? And to that, I would say yes, but what I want to point out, and I'll show you the page again, you're going to see this type of page for every president we talk about in class. And I'll actually flip just a couple more pages. For example, here you have it, kind of rounding out the first 5 presidents. I call that page the baseball card. Think about a baseball card. I know nobody collects baseball cards anymore, but what's on a baseball card? Statistics. So what we're going to create is a baseball card for every single president we'll talk about in class this year. And what you'll have at the end of the semester is a nice, tidy little study guide for every single president. Basically, the highlights of each man, each president, written into your various work packets. So even though we may take the same notes as a fill in the blank style, I'm also going to have you do it on the baseball card. And of course, that is putting your brain to your hand, to the paper with the facts. And that is how that is learning. So visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, trying to make you learn in all the ways. So you are set with papers in front of you. You have your earphones. You are listening on your own time. I know that I'm absent for several days. If you're listening to this in August of 2023, I am on my National Guard annual training. I am in the Republic of Georgia. Yes, ironic, the state of Georgia is paired with the country of Georgia. And of course, I'm gone for about 2.5 weeks. So you will have audio guides like this for several of our classes upcoming. And I've already laid out the expectations. Tuck in, do good work. And quite frankly, for some of you, this is probably a good slow down. I know I talk a lot in class and I lecture strong with energy. And for some of you, that might be too much. And you're like, I'm glad I can just sit and listen, pause the video as you need to, rewind. If I said something too fast, you can listen again. So just a different style of teaching, but I'm still here for you. And of course, if you end this class with any questions at all, it's the digital world we live in. You can connect with me on email, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So when I call this an audio guide, that means that you could really be listening to this video and looking at the slides, which have been posted as a PDF, or you can see they will be on the screen behind me, just the resolution might not be quite as good. I want to start with this. My class, we just finished with the Unit 1 benchmark test, so I have had a chance to look at the scores. Here's some simple observations, and this might not be true of every single student, but generally speaking, here's what I observe. If you do the notes, you have a favorable test score. I don't know if that sounds super obvious. It might, but if you committed to the work packet, you did the notes, you realize that you were prepared for the test. If you are not a student who did the notes, you turned in a lot of blanks, you crammed at the last minute, you copied your neighbor, you probably didn't have quite as favorable of a test score. So not rocket surgery there. Do the packets, do the work, then perform on the test. Hey, I'll take the athletics example. You can't just show up for game day. You got to practice along the way. So I know this isn't football or this isn't softball or, you guys like playing your games. This is still the same process. You have to practice in order to play the game. Practice is class. The game is the test. If you practice well, you probably tested well. And that's a simple observation there. As expected, there were a few high scores. Okay, we had hundreds. Don't say it was an impossible test. I had some hundreds on the test. A few low scores, and then, most in the middle. Just your average bell curve. Guys, it was test 1. Some of you maybe not quite as familiar with the Illuminate test platform. These questions aren't basic, who was the first president of the United States? George Washington. Questions aren't like that. Questions are going to have several vocabulary words built into them and then ask you to apply your knowledge. So we've talked a lot about how to approach questions, eliminate the wrong answers, at least get to 50-50. I'm not surprised by our test scores. Those of you that were in the middle or even lower, hang with me, okay? We're going to keep practicing. I'm happy to do one-on-one with you. Your test scores will improve. So just hang in there. That was unit 1, and now you know what it feels like. And as we walk through unit 2A, 2B, 3, 4, 3, and 4, okay, those are the units ahead of us. You know what to expect. So, all right, enough about the test. Let's jump into the presidency of George Washington, and I want you to start with this warm-up question. Now, I'm not asking you to write a journal page or anything like that. Maybe just stop and think to yourself. The question is, who do you trust to give you advice? And think about their name. Okay, so they have their name, and it may be a parent, maybe a coach, maybe a church leader. What's their name? And then that's probably easy. Here's the next part. What's their title? Not title as in youth pastor or softball coach, but I mean in your life, what's their title? I'm gonna give you my example here in just a second. And then most importantly, the reason why. Why do you trust them to give you advice? Is it their background experience? Is it their level of expertise? Is it that they know something you don't know? Why? So I'm going to pause for just a second, let you kind of think through that in your brain. And maybe you paused the video, maybe you didn't. But I'm gonna move on to show you my answer, and maybe you can kind of see where my brain was thinking on this particular question. Who do I trust to give me advice? My answer is my battalion commander, which is my Army boss. You guys know I'm in the Army National Guard. I have 2 jobs. So my battalion commander is my Army boss. I trust him to give me advice. Here's the title for me. To me, the title is Military Affairs Advisor. And you see how fancy that is, right? For you, it might have been hitting coordinator or spiritual guide, right? If it was a youth pastor or pastor, something like that. So Military Affairs Advisor, that is his title to me. And here's the why. He has more years of experience than me. Bottom line is he has about 7 more years in the Army than I do. He's experienced several things that I haven't. And when I approach a situation that's brand new, I might go to him for advice and say, sir, how would you approach this situation? And from his level of expertise, he's able to give me advice. So this is a warm-up question, which means we're going to come back to it in the lesson. So keep this in mind, and let's push forward. Into today's class will be the presidency of George Washington, and the next class will be the presidency of John Adams. Consider this a 2-part class with separate audio guides. So as a setup, we first need to talk about the office of the President of the United States of America. I mean, actually, the United States of America itself was a bold invention, an experiment. A lot of people call it the American experiment, and quite frankly, it was an enormous risk to break ways with the old monarchies of the era, bloodlines determining who is the next leader, and to create something that is of, by, and for the people, literally letting we, the people, elect our leader. That was a bold experiment and an enormous risk. So, we sit here in 2023 and talk about our first president, and we know that he was successful, but they didn't know that that would be the case at the time. It's very important to remember. Let's remember where we've come from: an 8-year war for independence. Independence finally achieved with the Treaty of Paris of 1783, but that was not set up for success. That did not mean we were going to be successful. Actually, that the war and the treaty was followed by a very intense debate about what comes next. What does our next government need to look like? What is a democracy, especially in a world ruled by kings or emperors, the monarchy style of government? Here's what our leaders decided on. The experiment would have 3 branches of government, and not to dive into a government class today, but as a reminder, those branches are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And what you need to know today is that all 3 of these branches were going to share power. That's a very tricky balancing act, especially coming from a world where a king held all the power, really all of those branches in one position. So this was going to be a very different idea by sharing power and balancing power between 3 branches. It was the office of the president, which we know as the executive branch, that most embodies the hopes and aspirations of the American people. The idea that this position could have power to lead through challenge and crisis, and also bear the burdens of the past and cast vision for the future. That's what made this position so special. And while we know the presidency in 2023, we live it today, right? You can turn on the news and see what the presidency has become. It's become that because it's been shaped by the unique personalities of all 45 men who have held that office. So George Washington is the first and shapes it in his own way, but every president has put his fingerprints and his impressions on the office to create it into what it is today. Of all the institutions that the framers of our Constitution, the founding fathers created, the most unique, the most novel, to use that word, was the office of the presidency. And the thing is, there was no real model for this in the 18th century world. There were not other governments that had an elected leader from the people. We can go backwards into ancient Greece and see threads of democracy, see some ancient democracy, but in the 18th century world, especially in Europe, it was kings, queens, and monarchs that ruled the day. So what is a president? That question was really open for interpretation and questioning. At the time the office was created, most countries lived under monarchies, and that meant that bloodline determined leadership, but the office of the president was going to be different. At the end of the revolution, you may have thought, oh yeah, patriots, we win, and we're all in this together. Well, at the end of the revolution, it really wasn't certain what type of government would be created or where that power would lie within the government. So yes, we won a war together, but very quickly, different opinions began to rear their heads and different leaders began to have different opinions. So the founding fathers were great politicians, but they were doing something brand new. None of them had experience in creating a brand new government. They had experience at the colonial level or at the state level, but none of them had experience with a national government. So for a lot of reasons, our early government becomes known as the American experiment. And quite frankly, to this day, it is known as the American experiment. An experiment, a bit of a scientific word, but the reason it's called that is because nobody had ever done it before. And quite frankly, nobody ever knew if it would be successful, if it would last. And you may say, why is it still called that today, 240 years later? Well, because it is still rested on the idea every single decision could unravel the American experiment. So that's why it is still an experiment. And of course, every new decision hopefully still keeps it together. Something really important to realize is that these 13 colonies could have very easily become 13 little countries. Yes, we fought a war together, but they could have easily decided, hey, okay, we got the British out of our continent. Now Massachusetts is going to be its own country. And North Carolina is going to decide what's best for North Carolina. And Georgia, well, Georgia's way different than New Hampshire. So Georgia's going to make decisions based on the Southern economy, and New Hampshire go ahead and decide for itself. Very easily could have been 13 different countries. And obviously that would have changed what is America. I mean, as I look to the map today, maybe your right-hand side as you sit in the room, imagine each of those borders being the borders of a country, not of a state. But that is not what happened. We did become united under one Constitution. And that, quite frankly, is miraculous in its own way. Lots of questions about the role of the presidency. How much power would it receive? Remember, what did we fight against? We fought against a powerful single central power, the head of state, the king, King George. King George was an abusive executive. So the framers naturally did not want to give the president a lot of power. They originally designed power to rest with the courts and the legislature. The legislature represented each state. The president was really just supposed to be a yes man to the legislature. Congress passes a bill, the president nods in agreement, and he maybe represents that bill to the world as the head of state, but he was not supposed to have his own opinions or express his own opinions to the legislature. He was supposed to be that yes man for the president. We obviously know that's not exactly the way it is today, and that's because of early decisions made by George Washington and every president since. At the outset of this new government, the big question became, how do we elect the president, right? If we're going to have the people choose, well, just how about do we go choosing this first president? At first, the belief was, now this comes off as a little elitist, at first the belief was that ordinary Americans would not be educated enough to choose a candidate for president. oh, we can't have these backwoods farmers casting a vote for who's going to lead our country. And yes, that does come off as elitist, and it is the wealthy who were bringing that idea forward. So the system becomes, and this is still the system to this day, it's a little less elitist today, it is still the system to this day, it's called the Electoral College. And the idea is that citizens will vote for a group of electors who are pledged to vote for a specific candidate. So I know nobody in the room in high school here has ever voted before, but when you're 18 and you cast a vote for president, you're actually not voting for the person, man or woman. You're not voting for an individual person. You're voting for a group of people who are pledged to vote for that candidate. So in Georgia, the number of electoral votes we have, you vote for a group of, I think it's 25 electors who then will cast 25 votes towards your pledged candidate. So at the time, the idea was if the people vote for a bad candidate, well, then the electors, maybe they don't vote for who they're pledged for and they vote for actually the better candidate. And quite frankly, that's being a faithless elector. If you're pledged to vote for someone and you don't, well, you kind of have violated your own personal integrity. Today, that is still the case. An elector could flip-flop, if you will, but rarely happens, and it has never affected the outcome of a whole election. But that was one of the early fail-safes. Let's not have just a direct democracy. It is a representative democracy, something we've already talked about a little bit, also talked about in world history. Now, the looming question is who will be first? And this question really threatens to doom the Constitutional Convention because we have an idea, we know what we want the office to be, we've decided on how to choose this person, but who will be first? There are many candidates that no one really agreed upon until finally, George Washington offers himself forward as the first candidate. George Washington agrees to run for president. So now all the candidates all the delegates at the Constitutional Convention are reassured. They knew that Washington would not try to become a king. You see, Washington has already rejected that offer. At the end of the Revolutionary War, being the military leader that he was, leader of the Continental Army, a lot of people wanted to put a crown on him. They wanted to make him His Excellency, His Majesty, King George Washington, who will lead our new country. And of course, the idea was that, whoa, that's not what we fought for. So George Washington literally walked away from power. And at the time, that was quite unheard of. So now, 8 years later, these delegates, they know his character. They know that he will not try to consolidate power. He already had the chance, and he didn't. So he is the consensus first president. So now let's kind of dive into your notes and his presidency. Remember where we've come from? We've already come through the American dance revolution. We dabbed it up. We hit the gritty. We whipped and nay-nayed on the British, trying to say some Gen Z words there. And George Washington is, George Washington, the former military leader. Now, this is not George Washington the man. This is George Washington in the musical Hamilton. And Hamilton is a great tie-in to today's whole lesson. So let's talk about America in 1790, right? This is the America that George Washington is going to be elected into. So predominantly a rural society. This is where your fill-in-the-blank notes pick up. About 80% of households, that's how you know you haven't moved enough when the lights turn off on you. About 80% of households were into agricultural production. So that those southern colonies and their tobacco cash crop production, that was the dominant profession in the country at this time. There are about 750,000 African Americans in the country, and that is 20% of the population. That does not mean they're all enslaved, but that is just a count of African Americans in the country. Most of them living in the South, about 10% of them in the North or frontier. So 10% of them perhaps not enslaved, about 90% of them enslaved. So, again, most of them involved in agriculture, production, and slavery, but there were some free blacks in the country as well. So this is just important to set the stage. What does George Washington get elected into? So beginning of a new government. Congress convenes March 4th of 1789, and they choose, and one of the first orders of business is to vote for president. So with everything I've already described, George Washington takes the first ballot with 69 electoral votes. That is unanimous. Okay, that is all electors voting for George Washington. So at the time, the winner, becomes the president, and then the second place becomes the vice president. So Washington sweeps the first ballot, and then the winner of the second ballot with 34 electoral votes is John Adams. So he becomes the vice president. That is not how it works today. Today they run together on what is called a ticket. But at the time, it was first ballot or first vote getter becomes president. That was George Washington. Second most vote getter, which in this case was on the second ballot, was actually split between Jefferson and Adams. John Adams winning more. John Adams wins the vice presidency. Um, and of note, and this is something we'll talk about in a government class in a few days, the Bill of Rights is also adopted by this Congress and is ratified about 18 months later in 1791. So a lot going on in this first Congress being convened in 1790. We have a president elected. We have the Bill of Rights adopted. And there you have it, George Washington as the man. Of note, this is like a little extra fact about George Washington. Here's how I know in my heart. Here's why I can believe that he was a servant of the people. Because when he won the presidency, he literally had to take out a personal loan to go to his own inauguration. At the time, the capital city was in New York City. No, not Washington, D.C. And we'll talk about that in a second. But George Washington, in order to get from his home in Virginia to the capital of the country in New York City, he had to take out a personal loan in order to travel and pay for his inauguration festivities. So it wasn't like he was walking into riches. It wasn't like he was going to consolidate power and become wealthy out of the deal. He actually went into debt in order to become the first president of the United States. So April 30th, 1789 in New York City, George Washington is sworn in as the first president of the United States. So there you have it. The theme of this class, we're going to talk about how he faces several challenges and how he establishes several precedents. So challenges and precedents are going to be what we talk about in the next few minutes here. Challenges. And when you look at your notes here, you're going to see 3 open boxes. What I want you to do is title kind of the top of each box with these 3 right here: debt, the British problem, and taxation. But then leave enough room in that box. I know it's not super large. Leave enough room in that box to write down a few details as well. So challenges faced: debt, the British problem, and taxation. Challenges faced by George Washington. So let's jump into debt. So following the Revolution, and we've been a country for several years at this point. We have battled through the failed Articles of Confederation. We have a new Constitution, and George Washington is the first president under the Constitution. Well, what he inherits is a nation that's deep in debt. So the value of currency was very low, and the idea of how to raise revenue, well, taxes. And something that's going to be really difficult about that is, didn't we fight a revolution over high taxes? Yes, we did. But let's not forget that that was no taxation without representation. So it's not the idea. The idea isn't that people shouldn't be taxed. It's the idea is that people should have a say in how they are taxed. Well, so as the first president, George Washington is going to have to deal with taxes. And a way he goes about that is also by creating what is known as the national bank. So in the blank box for debt, you should have these 3 bullet points written down. Moving along on your notes here and moving along in the category of debt, we're going to talk about Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton is not a president, arguably the most influential non-president, and he's in your notes for that reason, because he is a very significant key figure in this early government. He is a Federalist, and as we've talked about the differences between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and we will continue to talk about that a little bit more. Keep in mind that Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist. He's in Washington's cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury. So that's why we're going to talk about him right here under debt. And he says, this is his philosophy. All right. He's an economist. He's a money mind. He says that since the war since everybody fought the war, that makes the war debt a national responsibility, which should be paid by all states since all states benefited. Right? It wasn't a war for Massachusetts. It wasn't a war for Georgia. It wasn't a war just for Maine or Virginia. All states benefited. All states should pay part of the war debt. So he calls for a national assumption of debt. It's no longer Georgia's debt. It's America's debt. It's no longer North Carolina's debt. It's America's debt. And his belief is that this would create a sense of national pride, right? We fought the war. We will pay off the debt. We're all in this together, not just Georgia, not just Massachusetts, not just North Carolina. Like I said, we're not 13 small countries. We are the United States of America. So this is Alexander Hamilton and kind of some of his starting beliefs. Now, controversy, isn't there always? The controversy here is that most of the debt was held by the northern states, and most of southern states had already paid off their debt. So Alexander Hamilton, who is a northerner, who comes from money, he's not agricultural, he's not agrarian, which remember 80% of the country was. Alexander Hamilton's proposal basically benefits northern states and it's almost an affront to the southern states who have already paid their debts. I got an example for that in just a second. Alexander Hamilton, as you see him on the screen there, yes, is that Hamilton. He is the Alexander Hamilton of the musical Hamilton. So I know every year I got students who love the musical. They can sing the songs. They can rap the cabinet battles. I think Hamilton is a great production. And I just want to give you Mr. Swanson's pitch on Hollywood here. Every time we watch a Hollywood movie, we got to be able to recognize what is accurate and what becomes artistic license. Hamilton has plenty of exaggerations of characters and language and just quite frankly some facts that didn't necessarily, or some pieces in the story that just didn't necessarily happen in history. So while I like the musical and I sing the songs myself, let's make sure we're not watching Hamilton and thinking that it's 100% accurate, because it's not. That said, go home this weekend and watch Hamilton and enjoy the history that is inside of it. Here's my example about northern and southern states sharing the debt. So I want you to imagine in the room here, and I know you're listening by yourself. I want you to imagine that in the room we're going to the Super Bowl. All right, the tickets have been offered to the Super Bowl. So my example here is Super Bowl tickets. The left side of the room, or you're doing this on your own. Just imagine that half of the room you budgeted. You made sacrifices and you went out and bought your Super Bowl ticket with cash. Okay? You didn't take that weekend trip so that you could have enough money for the Super Bowl. You didn't go out to eat a couple of times so that you could have enough money in the bank to buy your ticket. You worked hard, you saved, you bought the Super Bowl ticket, and it's in your hands. You have your ticket. Let's go to the Super Bowl. Right side of the room, on the other hand, you're more on that plastic economy. You went zip with the credit card. You bought your Super Bowl ticket with a credit card. And while that means you're supposed to pay it back, you didn't really feel that financial crunch right then. And all things considered, you didn't really save or sacrifice. You just zipped the credit card, and guess what? You got the same Super Bowl ticket. So now imagine that someone comes into the room and he agrees to pay off any remaining money that is owed for any Super Bowl ticket in room 1206. Well, in my example here, who's really happy about that? Obviously, the answer is the people who paid on credit. Let's say that they bought the $3,000, 50-yard line, third row ticket, zip, credit card, no cash out of pocket. And all of a sudden, this benefactor, this very generous person comes in and is going to pay for that debt. Woohoo! They're happy. What about people that paid in cash? What about the people that don't have a debt? They are a little more than just not being happy. They're probably grumbling because some people got their debt wiped out, but they, having already paid cash, received no benefit from this offer. So with that as an example, imagine now that the southern states are the ones who have already paid their debt. The southern states are the ones who've already paid for their Super Bowl ticket, or in this example, they have already paid their debt. Northern states have not paid their debt. They used the credit card. Alexander Hamilton's national bank seems to benefit them. Of course, they are all about absorbing a national debt and sharing it together, and the southern states are not. So let's negotiate, right? How do we make both sides happy? Here's the agreement. Southern states agree to the national bank as long as the national capital is moved into Southern territory. So the Southern territory is going to be Washington, D.C. That means Virginia gives up a portion of its land to become Washington, D.C., and Maryland. We basically create a 10-mile by 10-mile square that will be the national capital, and some of these two states gave up some of their land in order to create Washington, D.C. Now, I know where we sit in Georgia today, you got to go north to get to Washington, D.C. You might consider that a northern area. At the time, coming out of Virginia in particular, it was considered a Southern territory and a Southern capital. So Southern states agreed to this debt consolidation as long as the new capital is in the South. And of course, that's how we get Washington, D.C. to this day. Northern states agreed to let the national capital go to the District of Columbia as long as the national bank takes on their ordinance. So in that regard, both states got what they wanted. Both types of states, both regions got what they wanted. And this is where we get Washington, D.C. as our national capital. You see the map here, so or probably better to look on your PDF. You see the map there, and you can see the 10 by 10 square that is Washington, D.C. D.C. stands for the District of Columbia, Washington coming after the name of George Washington, and that is Washington, D.C. to this day. This territory will be affected a little bit come the time of the American Civil War, but we will talk about that then. Hamilton and the National Bank. So Hamilton wanted the bank so that we could print a national currency and take care of war debt. No longer is there a Massachusetts coin and a Georgia dollar and South Carolina, bank notes. Now we're going to have a national currency, and that's going to take care of our national war debt. The national bank becomes a source for expanding capital and growing the economy. This is not an economics class, so I'm not going to dive into all the moving pieces of the economy, but he says that the national bank can help all of us together. And he also argues that the bank is necessary because it falls under Article 1 of the Constitution. See, critics of the bank are going to say, well, the Constitution doesn't say we should create a national bank. If it's not written in the Constitution, we can't do it. Hamilton is going to be of the philosophy that the Constitution is elastic, or meaning that there's phrasing in Article 1 that says anything that is necessary or proper for running the government is permissible. Hamilton argues that the bank is necessary and proper for running the government, therefore it is permissible. So some people say can't have it because it's not in the Constitution. Hamilton says it doesn't matter that we didn't say the words a national bank. We have the clause that says that we can do anything necessary and proper, therefore we can have a national bank. Critics of the bank, well, Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is going to be one of them. Not President Jefferson, not Vice President Jefferson. This is Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson argues that the national bank does not fall under Article 1's necessary and proper clause. Thomas Jefferson is an anti-federalist. So Hamilton, federalist, Jefferson, anti-federalist. You can see the early formation of political parties here. Now, they didn't call themselves a party, but anti-federalists, federalists, and their diverging ideas are essentially the beginning of political parties. James Madison also falls into the anti-federalist camp, and the anti-federalists are saying that the national bank is unconstitutional. Since we didn't agree to it in writing in the Constitution, you can't just make it up out of thin air. Obviously, Hamilton, the opposite side, he says that it is necessary and proper, therefore we can have it. Well, let's take a vote. The vote is that Northern reps voted for the bank, Southern reps voted against the bank, but by the numbers, the bank is created because more people voted for it. So we're beginning to see the divide by section here, right? There's a northern section that believes one thing and a southern section that believes another thing. And fast forward 130 years, and we're going to see north versus south in a totally different way as well. So even though we're not on the verge of a civil war here, we can see the seeds being planted for sectionalism, and we can see a divide between north and south. This whole topic, the national bank, leads to a debate and a question about should we interpret the Constitution strictly, as in if it's written in the Constitution, you can do it, and if it's not written in the Constitution, you can't do it. That's a strict interpretation, or a broad interpretation. And the people who interpret a Constitution broadly always point to this necessary and proper clause, sometimes called the elastic clause, as if to say the Constitution is elastic. And, could the framers have understood the world that was coming? And bring it into today. Could framers understood what is the internet, or what is digital commerce, or what is the way weapons have advanced? Obviously they had muskets and gunpowder, and today we have automatic rifles and belt-fed ammunition. Some people are going to say that the Constitution is elastic, and that necessary and proper clause allows for a broad interpretation of the Constitution. Try to give it real simple here and try to sum up the two diverging thoughts. Again, I'm not going to call them political parties, but the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists are kind of an early division that will become political parties. So the strict interpretation belongs to Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists. You can only do what is specifically in the Constitution. The broad interpretation belongs to Hamilton and the Federalists. You can do whatever is necessary for the government to function. So that's a pretty good one slide right there to sum up Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Well, what about Washington? I haven't mentioned him, and today's class is about George Washington. Here's the verdict on the national bank. George Washington accepts Hamilton's argument that the government does have the right to create the national bank, even though it's not specifically listed in the Constitution. Therefore, by vote of the legislature and adoption by the executive, the president, the national bank is created. It's overseen by the federal government. And of note, 80% of it is financed by outside investors. So all this worrying about consolidating money and power, for the most part, the national bank is financed by outside investors. Important note here, I do not think George Washington is a Federalist. History does not reflect that George Washington was on either camp, Federalist versus Anti-Federalist. And in fact, one of his core beliefs is to make sure that we don't have division via political party. That doesn't mean he didn't have opinions. And in this case, weighing his constitutional obligation, he does agree with Hamilton and the more broad interpretation of the national bank. So kind of round out Alexander Hamilton's legacy here, and this is in your notes as well. His achievements overall as Secretary of the Treasury with creating the national bank, he does enhance the value of the dollar. He gives the dollar some legitimacy on the international stage as well. He secures the government's credit, and with that comes the ability to trade with other countries. He attracted foreign capital, or you could say trade. So again, we're trading with other countries. And under his ideas and leadership, the country does begin to prosper and flourish. So in some ways, you could say that his broad interpretation of the Constitution was in fact necessary and proper and helped the country. Some weaknesses. Every person's legacy has positives and negatives. So what are some of his weaknesses? As a Northerner, someone from money, and you could accuse him of being an elitist, he never really understood people of the frontier, people of agriculture, and he never really had their best interests in mind. He just wasn't able to understand their lifestyle. He never lived it. So you could say that he didn't do a good job of representing everybody. He only represented the people from his personal background, and that often makes him being accused of being elitist. His true legacy, or at least the one we probably remember the most today, comes from the musical Hamilton and the climax of the musical Hamilton, which is Hamilton's duel with current Vice President Aaron Burr. So just briefly to give you the background on that, Hamilton, removed from politics at the time of the duel, finds himself in what is known as an affair of honor. He had to defend his honor against the sitting Vice President Aaron Burr. And these two gentlemen go to the dueling grounds. And even though dueling was technically illegal, it did happen frequently in this era, in this time period. And what we have here is bit of a muddy history, because some will say Alexander Hamilton raised his pistol into the air, fired his shot, threw it away, and that's ironic for the lyrics of the song, I'm not throwing away my shot. Some will say that Hamilton threw away his shot, and Burr then took his shot, struck Hamilton in the chest, and Hamilton died. Now, whether Hamilton missed or threw away his shot, quite frankly, we'll never really know. There's mixed reports from what happened in that moment on that day. But we can say for certain is that Aaron Burr struck Hamilton in the chest, and Hamilton died about 36 hours after being shot. And this is certainly part of his legacy. So plenty more reading you can do about that, and I will hyperlink a few articles and videos, but certainly this is the way most people remember Alexander Hamilton today. So I know that was a long conversation about the first portion of debt, George Washington's challenges with debt. Let's move on to what is the British problem. So in that small box there, under the British problem, write this down. Write down what's in red. After the war, here's the deal. We won the war and we signed the treaty. And after the war, the British still wouldn't leave us alone. Us, US, right? Wouldn't leave us alone. They did several things. 3 things. This is what you need to write into the box, and I know it's small. 1, they continued seizing U.S. ships at sea. They did have the more powerful Navy. So they would seize merchant ships, and something that they would do is called impressing those sailors into service for the crown. So imagine that your ship is overtaken by a more powerful British ship, and you, who woke up as an American merchant, go to bed as a British sailor or a member of the British Navy. Obviously, that's kidnapping, or that you could make an argument for that being a military action as well. And we can't stand for that, right? I mean, like, how are we going to just let our people be captured? Why would anybody ever go to sea to be a merchant marine, or a sailor for that matter, if this keeps happening? We're going to have to address that. Two, they wouldn't leave forts on the frontier. They left inside of the 13 colonies, but remember, we gained land all the way up to the Mississippi River, and the British did not vacate many of those forts. So even though they weren't actively fighting and there weren't battles, they're just still there, which they weren't supposed to be. Part of the treaty was that they would leave. And then number three is that they still had not repaid many stolen or damaged goods, to include crops and slaves following the war, which this was agreed to in the treaty, right? They were going to pay a certain financial amount for damages from the war. They had not paid this. So all things considered, they're still being a little bit bossy to us, the young nation. And it does kind of make sense because, we're a toddler, if you will. At this point, let me make that analogy. We're a toddler, and they are still the distinguished gentlemen on the world stage. So, they're still kind of bossing us around. Obviously angry, I would say angry that we beat them, and they're doing what they can to still make life difficult for us. So this is the British problem. Question for you. If you were George Washington at this time, what would you do now? Well, I'll just tell you what he did. George Washington sends John Jay to England to negotiate what will become known as Jay's Treaty. This is in your notes. So be sure you go ahead and write down. All that's on the screen here. Here's what John Jay negotiates. What he's supposed to negotiate: 1, stop seizing U.S. ships; 2, vacate forts on the frontier; and 3, make those payments you're supposed to make. Right. So we got 3 problems. Let's get 3 solutions. Here's what John Jay comes home with, and it's not something that's going to make a lot of people happy. In the end, it was considered a very failed negotiation and a very weak treaty. In the end, the British do agree to leave forts on the frontier, but that's about it. They do not acknowledge that they're impressing our sailors, and they do not agree to stop that. They do not send home any money or make any agreements to pay what they originally agreed to pay. So John Jay is kind of like 1 for 3, if you will, only getting them to agree to leave the frontier. So the treaty is met with a lot of disdain or outrage at home, but Washington accepts the terms. He agrees to take something rather than nothing. So this is how he approached the British problem. Challenge number 3, taxation. And again, we're coming off of a war where we hated being taxed. So it's probably hard to talk about taxing people when people think they fought a war to not be taxed. Let's see how George Washington approaches taxation. So the country needs revenue, right? I mean, we have to agree that we pay some taxes for the benefit of the whole. And as long as we're being represented in Congress, at least I'm being taxed with representation instead of being taxed without representation. One of the early taxes George Washington and his leaders come up with is a tax on whiskey. Actually, Alexander Hamilton, enter him again. Hamilton proposes a tax on whiskey, and really it's the excess grain that is used to ferment and make the drink, whiskey, that is being taxed. Well, who's angry about this? Farmers who make whiskey, right? They're angry that their product is being taxed. Of all the products you could tax, they chose to tax whiskey. And so that is going to make whiskey producers angry. What do? Well, the 1791 proposal for this tax angers the mostly frontier farmers who are producing this excess grain. Great example of how Hamilton didn't necessarily always understand the life of frontiersmen or the life of farmers. So in the summer of 1794, enough's enough, at least from the perspective of these farmers, and those in western Pennsylvania revolt. They rebel. They, more than just not agreeing to pay the tax, they actually raise a mini militia, and they intend to march towards Washington, D.C. and let their angers be known. Well, George Washington has a couple of decisions to make here now. 1, he calls on the army. First, he calls on the standing army to suppress the rebellion, right? If you have a militia, I'm going to send my army to strike down your militia. And what he's doing here is he sets an example that the Constitution is strong enough to enforce the law. And this is a stark contrast to the previous Shays Rebellion, where the federal government or the Articles of Confederation government was unable to suppress Daniel Shays and his militia. So Shays Rebellion reveals the weaknesses of the Articles. The Whiskey Rebellion reveals the strengths of the Constitution. If you are George Washington in this situation, what would you do? I'll tell you what he did. More than just sending the army to put down the rebellion, he rides into battle with the army. This is George Washington on his steed, on his horse, leading the army into Western Pennsylvania to put down these revolts. This is the only time that a sitting president has led troops in battle, right? George Washington, first president, former military commander, of course, leads troop into battle. And what happens is that when the Whiskey rebels hear that George is coming, they agree to disperse, disband, stop revolting. And it showed two things. One, that Washington was strong enough to put down a rebellion, but also showed the great respect that these men had for Washington. Many of them would have been Revolutionary War veterans. And just upon hearing that General Washington was coming to put down their rebellion out of respect for the man, what he's already accomplished as a military leader, and who he is as president, they disbanded. So it just shows it's a great example of showing the strength of the Constitution. Great major takeaway here. Shays Rebellion highlights the weaknesses of the Articles, the situation where the government was not strong enough to put it down. The Whiskey Rebellion highlights the strengths of the Constitution because the government was strong enough to put it down. So summary slide, there you have it. 3 challenges, 3 solutions, and we got check marks for all of them. All challenges that come towards Washington, he accepts the challenge, and this is part of his legacy. So those are challenges. Let's move on to precedents set. And first of all, we need to discuss what is a precedent. Well, a precedent, really simple definition, which is on your notes, a precedent, not a president. A precedent is an action that was taken by a president that is followed by future presidents. Actions taken that were/are followed by future presidents. Basically a first. A precedent is a first. And George Washington had several issues that he had to decide how to behave on. Virtually everything Washington did took on significance because it was the first. He is the first president. That makes everything he does literally a precedent. Should he accept a dinner invitation? Do presidents do that? Should he attend funerals? Do presidents do that? Washington very deliberately sought the advice of the people around him, and everything he did in his presidency was a precedent. So let's take a look at some significant ones. So first of all, he accepts the modest title of Mr. President. Might sound really trivial, might sound really basic, but one of the big questions of the day is, what do we call the president? Because coming off of the era of the monarchies, it was His Excellency, Supreme Majesty, the King, and a lot of times, there's background music and, all the pomp and circumstance that comes with that. And, a lot of people saw that vested in with how much power does the president have. John Adams wanted it to be regal. Okay, John Adams, who will be the second president, John Adams wanted it to be His Majesty, the President. But Washington agrees to the modest title of Mr. President. He sees it as dignified, but also approachable. Okay, the president is not a king. The president is a citizen who has been elected to lead the country. So precedent number 1 accepts the modest title of Mr. President. Precedent number 2, he forms a cabinet of close advisors. And here's where I want you to go back to your warm-up question. Who do you trust to give you advice? Now, when I say cabinet, no, not those cabinets, not like your mama has in her kitchen, or maybe she has a dream kitchen with certain types of cabinets, not those cabinets. When I say cabinet, I'm talking about a group of trusted advisors who are experts in various fields. Very importantly is they are not yes men. Okay, George Washington did not assemble a team who's going to agree with everything he said. He actually assembled a team of rivals, men who were of opposing ideals. So George Washington's cabinet starts with four men, and hang on to that because I'm going to show you what today's cabinet looked like. It's more than four. George Washington's cabinet started with the Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, and the Attorney General. And here is a picture of George Washington and his cabinet. Some would say that the Vice President is included in there as well, and the Vice President can certainly be an advisor, but the cabinet here are these use the title Secretary. So of note, I want to point out that the Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, and the Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson, an anti-Federalist. So you can imagine that those cabinet meetings maybe got spicy at times, and the debate and the tensions were very high. And actually, in the musical Hamilton, there are two cabinet rap battles, two of the more popular songs, and it comes out of these differing ideas. And if you know the musical and if you know history, you know that Hamilton and Jefferson were opposed to each other. So just imagine the genius of George Washington saying, I'm going to put these two men in the same room because I know they're not going to agree with me. How many people in the world would want a team that just agrees with them, right? That's what the kings were, okay? The monarchs had a team. If they had advisors at all, they were men who were going to agree with the king, right? Yes, Your Majesty, that's a great idea, Your Majesty. We totally agree, Your Majesty. George Washington wanted the opposite. As skilled as he was in many different areas, obviously he was a military general. He still has a Secretary of War. He had a mind for the economy. He still has a Secretary of the Treasury. And it's a humble admission that I need advice. So I think this is one of the very foundational precedents set by George Washington. The idea that one man can't do the job by himself. This is going to be very different from a monarchy with a king who is all powerful. I choose to have advisors in my cabinet. So when we say cabinet, we're not talking plates and bowls and knives and forks and knives. We're talking about individuals who advise the president. Here's today's cabinet. This is President Biden's cabinet, and the cabinet has swelled to 17 different cabinet positions. And you might, on one side, you're like, well, that's too many. How can you listen to 17 people? And I'll hear that argument. And then on the other side, well, the world has grown and changed. So some of the newer cabinet positions are Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Energy, Education Secretary, Veterans Affairs, Department of Homeland Security, very important cabinet position born out of the September 11th terrorist attacks. So you can see that the cabinet has grown in 240 years, but it's also because the world has changed and grown in that time as well. Moving on with precedents, keeping on with precedents here. So George Washington delivers the State of the Union address. State of the Union address happens every year, usually in February, possibly in March. It's not specifically locked onto the calendar. And President Biden has delivered a State of the Union every year he's been in office as well. And in fact, I always encourage my classes to watch the State of the Union and pay attention to what the president is saying. The heart of it, what it is in the title. It's the state of the union. How are we doing as a country? What is the state of our country? And, today it's become a political thing where the president outlines his plan for the year. And a lot of times people from his party stand and clap, and people from not his party look grumpy. And every now and then there's something where everybody stands and claps. But the first one, precedent setting, the first one was from George Washington. Moving on with precedents, very important is that George Washington serves only 2 terms as president. 2 4-year terms, so 4 plus 4, that's 8 years. He did not have to step down. The Constitution did not say a president only serves 2 terms. Now today, and you'll see on your notes, you'll see on the slides and on the screen, today the president is limited to 2 terms by the 22nd Amendment. We make that decision later after President Franklin Roosevelt serves 4 terms. We decide that 2 terms is enough. Why? Because that's what George Washington did. His precedent was followed by many presidents up to Franklin Roosevelt. There were many presidents who could have potentially run for a 3rd term and chose not to. They said, hey, 2 was enough for George. I'm going home as well. Time for the next president to step in. Another situation where he willingly steps down from power unheard of in the world of monarchies and kings, right? Actually, King George III, who is still in power in England, when King George III hears of his former rival, or maybe current rival, George Washington stepping down after 8 years in office, King George III says this: if this is true, he is the greatest man in the history of the world for stepping down willingly from power. A very important precedent that is followed by most presidents, and today is a constitutional amendment. So if you ever hear, the president gets into his second term, he is not going to run for a third term because constitutionally he is not allowed to. Unheard of at this time, very precedent setting. And finally, another concluding thought for George Washington and his precedents is that he delivers a farewell address. And in his farewell address, he says several more things that are going to pave the way for the country going forward. So let's look at his farewell address in the musical Hamilton. This is the song One Last Time, as if he's addressing the country one last time. So let's look at the details of it. And I think if you know the song, you'll see that a lot of these are reflected in the song as well. First of all, he asks for unity. Instead of regional or sectional loyalties like I belong to the South, I belong to the North, I'm a farmer, I'm a banker, he says, let's remember that we are one country. Let's remember who fought the revolution together. We did, we all did. Let's remember, let's have unity in our country. He advocates for neutrality. This is kind of looking into foreign affairs, looking out to the world stage. The phrase he actually uses, foreign entanglements, avoid foreign entanglements. France and Britain, in this whole time period, his whole presidency, have kind of been on the verge of war, and even in a quasi-naval war with each other. Washington says, avoid European affairs, avoid foreign entanglements, stay neutral. From his perspective, we're a very young country, and he believed that we didn't have the economy or the military to battle a European power. And he said taking either side is going to be harmful to our country. So neutrality, avoid foreign entanglements. And that is from his farewell address. Next is that he believes that a good government is based on religion and morality. You could do a deep dive into George Washington's personal faith, personality, and he was a man of prayer. He was a man of reading scripture. And in his farewell address, he says that good government should be based on religion and morality. And finally, he warns against political parties, something he calls factions. We wouldn't exactly say that they were political parties at the time, but he calls them factions. He warns against factions. And I leave this one very last for a reason, to show you that just because George Washington did it or said it doesn't mean it was followed. Obviously, political parties start to build very shortly after he steps down from his second term. So just because George Washington, the beloved leader of the country, said it or did it, doesn't mean that it was followed, letter of the law, by everybody. Some things, precedent setting, and last for a long time. For example, neutrality is going to guide our country all the way into World War I and even World War II. We attempt to stay neutral until we're drawn into the war. However, political parties is not something that the people pay attention to, and political parties start to form very quickly after George Washington leaves the office. Something really cool about Washington's farewell address is that it is read on the floor of Congress it's read on the floor of Congress on the occasion of his birthday. So that's in February of every single year. And something that they do is they alternate who reads it. They alternate which party that person is from. So one year a Republican reads it, and then the next year a Democrat reads it, Republican, Democrat. And what I would say to that is that I wish these people would actually know what was in it. I wish our leaders, our legislative leaders, would more than just recite the thing, they'd actually understand the thing and kind of remember what George Washington offered on his way out the door, especially that part about avoiding factions and calling for unity. I think that that's something that we could all benefit from today. These last few slides here, I know this video is approaching an hour. These last few slides here, just some bonus information about George Washington. This is a bust that is at the Virginia State Capitol. And the reason I want to show you this picture right here is because George Washington's granddaughter, when she saw this sculpture, she said, "Yep, that's my grandpa. That's it." For all the paintings and pictures and attempts to make a picture that looks like George Washington, this sculptor, he got it the closest, he got it most right. And I think if George Washington's granddaughter walked into the room and saw this and said, "Wow, that's my grandpa," I'm gonna believe her opinion. I'm gonna believe what she said. So I really like this bust because it makes me feel like I'm looking at George Washington. The internet's a wild place. There's a whole lot of representations of what George Washington might look like with artificial intelligence, or if he was a modern president, how would he look in a suit and a tie? So look at the sculpture there, and then look at this representation. Maybe, right? Maybe that's pretty close. This one makes him look a little much more grandfatherly, but I kind of like this picture as well, the suit and the tie. This is a full body representation that sits in the Virginia State Capitol, and again, that face is based off of the same bust sculpture. So again, I feel like that's the man. And again, here when this sculpture was seen by Marquis de Lafayette, who was a young man who served with George Washington in the American Revolution, Marquis de Lafayette says that is the man himself. So same story. If Marquis de Lafayette thinks that's what he looks like, I'm going to agree that that's what he looks like as well. Very beautiful picture there. And kind of a rendering of him as a modern military commander. Obviously, his hair would have been different in a lot of ways. I always get a kick out of that picture. And this one as well kind of imagines him as a U.S. Marine. Kind of a funny picture to look at as well. So just kind of closing it out with a few smiles about the history of George Washington. Hey, as with everything, I've given you this much. I know I feel like I talked for an hour. I've given you this much about George Washington, and there is so much more to study about. I always say I'm just a sticky note on the tip of the iceberg, and we know that icebergs are mostly below the surface. So there's so much more information out there about George Washington and about his military leadership and his presidency. So what I hope I can always give to you is to encourage you to be a lifelong learner and reader. I have hyperlinked several additional videos to this Google Classroom post. So once you're done with my notes in the video here, you can dive into the packet. There's some reading for you to do. There's a page, an article, and some questions about Washington's farewell address, and several other video options for you to watch to round out this class. So wherever you're watching, whenever you're watching, thank you for your time and attention. I hope I have added to your knowledge. I hope that you know something now that you didn't know when you woke up today. So Mr. Swanson from room 1206 and in the Republic of Georgia. See you next time.